Now, a often fascinating point in North American history, which still persists to this day, is what is known as the French and Indian War, or for the rest of the world, the Seven Years' War. What started out nothing more as a fight between Britain and France would soon spill over to the European continent, leading to the almost death of Prussia and the eviction of France from the majority of their colonies at the time. Now, I will not be talking about what were to happen if France instead won the Seven Years' War. Instead, I'm here to ask what if France achieved a very, very limited victory by holding on to Canada? More or less, what if Canada remained in the hands of the French? Now, this video I couldn't have come up with on my own. This video actually came from a suggestion made by one of my good friends. And this video, safe to say, is a very interesting one that I have researched, and with it I have come with quite the interesting conclusions on how this affects the world. And with it, we now need to dive into this. So, where do we begin? Well, with the 7 Years' War. Duh. And we don't really need to change anything major about this war. We don't need France to achieve a victory and evict Britain from America, because again, this is about Canada, not the North American continent as a whole. So we need to try and piece together a story that allows France to hold on to their North American holdings, while also basically losing on every other front. And how we do this is decently difficult. See, in terms of the 7 Years' War, Britain simply held the advantage over France, and I don't need to get into the naval department. In the North American theater, Britain was vastly superior to France in the majority of ways. Not to mention, they pretty much had the theater locked down due to their massive navy, which in no way France was going to be able to surpass. Not to mention, as this war turns into a, wider European conflict, France's attention simply has to be diverted elsewhere. Now again, the specifics about how we do this is decently hard, so in my personal opinion, I find it best that we just simplify things. What we can instead do is have the French colonial forces in North America basically siege the Canadian colony and then stop after there. After seizing most of the Hudson Bay and Newfoundland, and the majority of modern-day Canada, they don't go down to the 13 colonies or anything into the modern-day United States. They simply hold out in modern-day Canada, and they don't go any further, committed to defending their position. Of course, we will assume, for the sake of this scenario, that France is able to hold on to their North American holding, and no amount of negotiation can get them to give up. The British Navy, although blockading the colony, is unable to beat its defenses, and as a result, France is allowed to hold on to Canada. Is this realistic? Not really. It overlooks a bunch of the issues that France faced in the 7 Years' War. However, again, if we want to achieve this outcome, then we have to go unrealistic for a bit in order to achieve the outcome that we desire. Now, again, we have our desired outcome, being the French conquest of what we consider modern-day Canada, and with it, most of North American history has been radically altered. But for the sake of this video, I will assume that the majority of other history, aka everything outside of North America, stays the same and follows our canon 7 Years' War. France is evicted from the majority of their colonies, Prussia holds on to dear life, Russia drops out, the usual. But now we can get into the potential side effects this has on France as a whole, and most importantly, North America. Let's start off with France, with the main question being, what is their debt? Are they more affected by debt or less affected by debt? Well, I'd still list it as being in the same. They have spent hundreds and hundreds on a costly war, which besides a underpopulated colony in the north, has pretty much gained them absolutely nothing. And while I won't be going over these in depth, specifically because the length of the video is already going to be decently long enough, there are some potential butterflies that can come about this. Perhaps France is burdened by less debt, and with it they are in a far more comfortable position to take on the problems of the time. i.e., an American Revolution, no matter how altered that may be, their funding to said revolutionaries, which bankrupted the French state, which may be avoided if there's still a bunch of money left over, though it may just get redirected to funding. Or, alternatively, the French Revolution as a whole might just be avoided. But again, nothing is a guarantee, and the French Revolution not occurring is quite the burden for me to do. So while I likely won't be doing it today, I might do it again in the future. But regardless, I am going to be keeping the post 7 Years of War environment the same, meaning that France is burdened by a bunch of debt. Now, of course, while we can keep Europe the same, North America is irreversibly changed by this, with of course some major questions, the majority of which relating to how a future Canada may actually develop following a French conquest. Now, of course, to get the obvious out of the way, instead of the English dominating Canada, like we are familiar with our timeline, instead it would be the Quebecois. Or rather, the entire thing would basically just be a giant Quebec, which scares the ever-living fuck out of me. Now, something that is kind of funny is we could see an opposite situation from the Quebec of our timeline, which is, instead of the French being the minority in Canada, instead it's the English that are the minority instead of this big-ass Quebec, assuming that there's any majority English population in this bigger Quebec, and they haven't left to the 13 colonies below or to the English homelands. Now, as for how this state works internally, well, I largely expect it to work in a similar way that Quebec did in our timeline, except on a national scale. Except the only difference is that instead of enjoying the riches of the British Empire and a massive amount of land, instead, Quebec is a small and insignificant part of the French Empire, primarily due to its lack of population, lack of, value, and the fact that France is in an economic crisis. And with this set in stone, Quebec and or the North American region is going to be a lot more poorer than it was in our timeline. But outside of the French reaction, how does Britain react to this? Especially Spain, since they do hold territory in the region. Now, as for Britain's reaction, it may not be as bad as you imagine. Specifically because, when you look at it, Britain doesn't really lose a whole lot. Yes, they lose North America, especially the fishing port of Newfoundland, but they still win the rest of the 7 Years' War, gaining them a considerably large colonial empire. Although, as we'll soon discuss, their North American holdout, and/or the 13 colonies, is going to be a real pain in the bum to deal with. But again, we'll cross that bridge when it gets there. But overall, while the British are likely, sad over the fact that they lost most of North America, they aren't completely decimated, and we shouldn't expect anything like them to go into immense debt like the French did in our timeline. Now, the Spanish reaction is likely muted for the time being. Napoleon did sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in our timeline, but with the French holding out in North America, we could just see that, except it goes to the French instead, creating not only just horrendous borders, but also driving a massive wedge between France and Spain, as if there wasn't one already due to the invasion. But again, we'll cross the European affairs when we get there. As we'll soon discover, the future of Europe could very well be altered by France owning Canada. And without a further ado, I think it's about time I stop teasing you and get to it. Now, the first domino to fall in this case will be the American Revolution. And it may even be worse than our timeline, since Britain, after losing territory, might actually tax the 13 colonies more in order to make up for the lost wealth. Though again, this isn't for certain. However, assuming the revolution plays out the same way, and we have it butterflied away, France is in an excellent position to help out the Americans, like they did in our timeline, but on an even better scale, as now they directly, border the American revolutionaries. Now, let's be clear here. If the revolution plays out in a similar way to our timeline, then we can expect the French to join in on the war or at least supply the revolutionaries. If they decide to join in on the war, then the British position in North America is kinda doomed. For the most part, not immediately. Don't expect the British positions to fall instantly, especially since the American revolutionaries are also having a decently tough time fighting the British. However, a two-front war, of which the French are supplying the Americans, as well as the fact that Spain is likely to join in later, then British positions in North America are very much under threat. And judging by how they are basically completely surrounded by hostile powers, it might be best just to make peace right now. And even better for the British, the Americans and French may just tear each other apart over the peace deal. But regardless, we can expect that the borders will look similar to our timeline, though with some minor changes. Said minor changes could be anything. I don't know for certain, but what I do know is that this disputed region up here by Maine may actually pass to the French, assuming that, well, they want to be compensated for their joining of the war. Assuming they did, and they didn't just sit on their ass and support the Americans. But assuming they join the war, then they likely take this small region. I have heavy doubts that the French are going to argue with the Americans over major regions, especially since if they do, it could easily allow Britain to exploit this rivalry and join up with the Americans against the French, which is something the French clearly do not like, especially since, again, they are in debt. And another war after they funded the revolution would surely destroy the hell out of their economy, or whatever is left of it. Now, Britain after this is basically fully evicted from the American continent. However, they aren't, well, fully gone, more or less the North American side. See, they still hold a lot of important territories in the Caribbean, of which are quite rich, and the French will be greatly missing out on. And again, although they have missed a bunch of land, there still is, well, the British colonial empire, all the way from India to the Caribbean. No matter where it be, the British Empire is not collapsing due to the loss of the North American theater. While yes, the North American theater is, well, again, lost and is pretty damaging towards the British, they are still in a better position than the French, who, after funding this costly revolution, are in a very, very similar position to our timeline. And with it, I'm pretty sure you know what's coming next. Of course, I'm talking about the French Revolution, and it could be drastically changed via this North American ownership. And with it, the whole history of the world could go any numerous amount of ways. Now, unless butterfly effects have me damned here, then I will assume that the French Revolution plays out to a similar way of our timeline, especially since the economic side is roughly stayed the same. Now, as I'm sure you know, in the French Revolution, the French royals later attempted to flee the country and were caught right on the French border, being forced to be, well, sent back and deal with the revolutionaries. However, there is a big juicy piece of overseas territory that they can flee to instead. And with this set, this drastically changes everything about the French Revolution. As well, the mainland is taken over. In exile, the French royals can still command their effort. Perhaps they may not even be captured and sent to the guillotine, assuming the territory remains loyal to their rule, which it very well may not. Now, the idea of a France-Taiwan situation would be kind of funny, but the issue is the fact that, well, Quebec isn't some miracle territory. It's still suffering the same issues as the French at home. The economic situation is horrible. Again, they barely have anyone living in the territory. And while yes, information about the revolution may spread, well, slowly, but when you think about it, if the French royals flee to Quebec and the news of the revolution reaches Quebec, then all of a sudden they might actually join the revolution and with it overthrow the royals. So we do have two scenarios here. One where France turns into, well, Taiwan, and the other one where Quebec joins the revolution. I am going to go with the latter one, but I will quickly explore potential outcomes of the first one. Now, if the French in Quebec decide to remain loyal to the royals, then it's very likely that the upcoming French Revolution could easily be changed, as the revolutionaries could be called a illegitimate government while the royal family just hangs out in Quebec. Louis might never actually get sent to the guillotine, and most about, French Revolutionary eras and royals being killed may not actually happen as they sit in Quebec as the whole continent decides to jump the revolutionaries. Does this mean they are successful? Likely not. I have heavy doubts that just because the French moved to Quebec, they are able to retake the homeland and return home. And plus, a world without the French Revolution is already as complicated as it is, and I don't need to mix these two together. But in short, if they do decide to flee, then the French royal family may never actually die, and as a result, most about French revolutionary stuff that we know could never actually happen. Now, assuming Quebec, joins the revolution, or the royals get killed before they can flee to Quebec, we do have some interesting ripple effects. Now, I have heavy doubts that the French Revolution is going to play out any differently, so I'm going to assume that it plays out in a similar manner of our timeline. But as I'm sure you know, most of Europe later gangs up against the revolutionaries, leading to the rise of Napoleon and yada yada. However, there is one main difference, being that when Britain joins the war, they also have to deal with the fact that, there's revolutionaries in Quebec. And while I highly doubt that they're going to do anything like launch a naval invasion of Ireland, it can still be an important part of the new revolutionary government. As, say, Napoleon still comes to power like our timeline, he could easily use his northern base of support to launch more naval attacks on Britain, or hell, he could even flee there instead of being exiled to Elba. But again, there are many outcomes that could follow here, and luckily for you, I'm going to dive into them. Now, the first outcome being that, history itself isn't all too changed by this, and realistically speaking, that is pretty likely. France does not have the strengths necessary to, take over Britain from Quebec or really expand elsewhere, as they're preoccupied with Europe. And the other powers in the conflict, besides, maybe Britain, does not have the power to, invade Quebec and seize it for themselves. Well, though, there is a few powers that are not in the wars of Napoleon that could do that. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now, the second outcome that could happen here is that Britain is able to launch a reconquest of Quebec and or Canada, and in doing so is able to cement themselves in North America. If they are able to do this, which they may actually be able to do so, depending on the force in Quebec and, how important Britain considers this territory to be, we very well could see something like a return to Canada, but with an even more intense Quebecois, as now they have been emboldened by French rule, and now they're pretty opposed to their new British overlords. The third outcome here is that, due to the war in Europe likely not being changed, we could actually see Napoleon eventually flee to Quebec and continue the war on there instead of being exiled. Now, again, this assumes that he's able to actually escape, and with the British having naval dominance, it is decently unlikely. But do you know how funny that would be if we just had a Napoleon in exile, but instead he rules over Canada? If this is the case, then the timeline where Britain attempts to invade Canada and or Quebec does seem more likely here. Or alternatively, they may actually just leave, Napoleon in Quebec for the rest of his reign, which has absolutely changed the course of North America to the point where I have absolutely no idea where it would go, but, it would be really funny. The next outcome here would be, with the Louisiana Purchase. Famously, in our timeline, Napoleon sold it to the United States for a good old chunk of cash. However, considering how he holds on to his own North American colony, he may actually buy it himself, or just sell it to his colony, but, that's less exciting. But In doing so, he likely makes a massive enemy out of the United States, as he is pretty much encircling them, which will very much make them ripe for conflict. And yes, I will address the United States shortly enough. Overall, though, there are quite a few different effects that could be applied to this Canada and or Quebec, depending on how things go and whether or not the revolution still arises. However, now we have to contend with what I'd argue to be the second main focus of this video, being the United States. How does Canadian and or American history develop following this, French annexation of Canada? Is there more conflict or less conflict? Well, I'd argue for the latter here, as I think there is likely less conflict between the two than that of Britain and the United States. After all, the French did fund the United States independence effort, and not to mention that, something like the War of 1812 happening the way it did in our timeline is very unlikely here. But if I am not incorrect in my assessment here, and the United States is still vaguely the same as our timeline, where, we haven't butterflied any presidents like Madison away, we can assume that, the United States will be a little tilted by French attitudes. By that, a large part of North American history would largely come down to the United States and Napoleon, since these two powers, depending on how they go, could radically shake up the continent's history, whether or not Napoleon flees there in exile and then the coalition attempts to coerce America into invading, whether or not America does a War of 1812 situation on their own, or whether or not conflict between the two just doesn't happen. Now, starting off basic, if the United States is still, remotely similar to the one in our timeline, the War of 1812 is likely avoided due to the fact that the British aren't messing around with the States, so they have no reason to really invade the British colony, especially because Britain isn't, in North America. But, if the United States is still expansionist and still wants to, conquer Canada, they likely see France as a much easier target to push over than Britain, especially since France is, across the ocean fighting against an entire continent. So, if it so pleases, the United States could easily do a War of 1812, but actually have it be super successful and annex the whole of North America. This would be a bit of a disaster for France, since they have largely gotten humiliated on the colonial scene. Though, again, if Napoleon still does his thing in, Europe, I doubt that it's going to be the talk of the town for a bit, as Napoleon basically colonizes Europe. But regardless, if it so pleases, the United States could easily invade France, and with it, could easily seize the North American colony. So that is where I'll end the scenario. Well, yes, this is a bit of a lackluster ending. Do be reminded that this is pretty much as far as I can get this without running into major hurdles, specifically that of being the US. And trust me, I do not want to make this video into an hour-long discussion about the US, though I could probably do that in the future. But anyways, thank you folks for watching. I'm almost at 500, so can we pretty please reach it? Anyways, I'll see you guys later.